The Making of Fahrenheit 451, a documentary written, directed, and produced by Laurent Bouzereau. Edited by David Palmer. Directors of photography, Ron Siegel, Chris Meager, Michael Osmond. Sound, Brett Brook, David Plitzkin. Music by Bernard Herrmann. Universal Studios Home Video Production Manager, Marianne Mancy. Universal Studios Home Video Executive in charge of production, Colleen A. Ben.
You all wear? What's it mean?
Oh, Fahrenheit 451.
Why 451 rather than 813 or 121?
Fahrenheit 451 is the temperature at which book paper catches fire and starts to burn.
Columbia University professor and author of a critical study on Francois Truffaut, Annette Insdorf.
When I first saw Fahrenheit 451, I wasn't sure what to think. I walked in assuming science fiction. I thought, okay, special effects, and I immediately felt a tension between the notion of Francois Truffaut, whose early films I had seen, namely Shoot the Piano Player, The 400 Blows, and Jules and Jim, and I thought, how is the director of such intimate, tender stories about relationships going to do a Ray Bradbury story? And it's in English yet.
Consider how all these writings, all these recipes for happiness, disagree. Now let this heap of contradictions burn itself out. You know, it's we who at this moment are working for man's happiness.
And while watching it, I felt, this isn't science fiction at all, is it? It took me a second viewing, and then actually a third, to realize what a rich motion picture Fahrenheit 451 is. If you walk in, as I initially did, assuming that you're going to get something with special effects and a real vision of the future, forget about it. What you're going to get, though, is Truffaut's really passionate homage to literature, to the written word, to the notion of a text as a living, breathing entity and process that can still affect us.
Behind each of these books, there's a man. That's what interests me so.
I think that's what hooked Francois Truffaut into the idea of Fahrenheit 451.
Producer Lewis M. Allen.
My wife, who is J. Preston Allen, who was a very fine screenwriter. In fact, she wrote the screenplay for Marnie. Jay and I had both been interested in the book in Fahrenheit, and were considering it as a film. And it so happened that Helen Scott, who was then at that time the head of the publicity for the French Film Office here in New York, brought Truffaut around to meet me. In fact, I think she was the person most responsible for making the New Wave known and popular in this country. Of course, she did Truffaut's translations for the Hitchcock book and other things. But what she wanted to do was introduce Truffaut and a few of the others to some young filmmakers here. Well, they came into my office, and Truffaut spotted on my bookshelf 6 copies of Fahrenheit 451. And he asked me about it, and I just told him, I said that, we were interested in it. He said, well, I'm planning to do 3 short films based on short stories by Ray Bradbury, and one of them will be in English, and maybe perhaps you might want to produce that one. The other 2 will be in French. And I said, oh, absolutely so. Well, he never got that finance. You can understand it's difficult to put together a triptych of films, 2 of them in French and 1 in English. And he wanted Paul Newman for that particular one. But that all fell through. And then a while later, he came back to me and said, well, I've dropped that, but I bought the rights to Fahrenheit. And I know that you were interested in it, and would you be interested? And of course I was. As a matter of fact, he had gone through many other companies before he came back to me, because I was really a neophyte. And at least as many leading men, leading actors. But at that point, he was trying to do it in French. And now, having given that up, he came back to me, and it took us a while, but we got it together.
Author Ray Bradbury.
When Francois Truffaut approached me to do Fahrenheit 451 for the screen, I was impressed because I'd seen his films, Jules and Jim and The 400 Blows, beautiful films. And I just recently had an offer from Otto Preminger, who wanted to do it, but I was afraid of him. He was very Germanic and very demanding, and I'd already gone through the process of doing Moby Dick with John Huston, who was difficult enough. He almost ruined my psyche. So I said, I can't do that again. And Truffaut is a much more gentle human being. There's a chance of doing it right.
Universal set up this European production company based in London and had Jay Cantor, the head of it. Jay Cantor had been Lew Wasserman's right-hand man, and I knew him fairly well. And when we got this going, I went to them. We only had, at that point, Truffaut, and we got, after going through I don't know how many possible leading men, we got Terence Stamp, whom Truffaut had just seen in Billy Budd and thought was wonderful for the part. But we couldn't get the financing just based on him. Julie Christie was suggested to us, and that was Terry Stamp who suggested her, though of course we were aware of her, but she was shooting Dr. Zhivago in Spain. And Truffaut and I flew down there to Madrid to visit her, and she agreed to do one of the parts. And it was when we got Julie Christie, of course, who had just made Darling, from which she won the Academy Award, that the financing, then instantly they jumped in and said, yes, we'll do it. I mean, that was purely based on the casting, not on the script. And to a certain extent, of course, on Truffaut, but basically they're looking for names. But of course, even then, we couldn't get a second girl to do the other part. We had the two girls. We tried Jean Seberg, who said she wanted to do anything with Truffaut, and Jane Fonda. And I have a feeling that they both found out that they'd both been offered a part in the thing. I only heard this, but they both turned it down. But the parts weren't very good individually. Truffaut had kept saying, you know, I don't want them to be a heroine and a villainess. I want them to be very much alike. Just two aspects almost of the same person, which of course instantly came to my mind, why not have Julie play both parts? And I sent a cable to Truffaut to that effect in Paris, and he came right back and said, oh, eureka, kind of, and that's of course exactly what I want. But at that point, Terry Stamp felt that we were giving her a bigger part than his and using her name, and he withdrew from the project. And we went on, and of course we finally got to Oscar Werner. Well, of course, Oscar Truffaut had worked with him on Jules and Jim, and subsequent to that, he did The Ship of Fools, where, of course, he made quite a success, which made him, you know, desirable as a leading man. But it came up pretty much the last minute before we got him. We just didn't have anybody else to play that part. And for the part of the fire chief, we did try so many people, I can hardly tell you. Laurence Olivier and Michael Redgrave and Sterling Hayden and on and on and on. After trying to get all those big names, Truffaut thought of Cyril Cusack, whom he'd just seen in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and thought was a very, very interesting actor. And it so happened that Cyril was available. So we got him more or less at the last minute.
What does Montag do with his day off duty?
Not very much, sir. Mow the lawn.
What if the law forbids that?
Just watch your growth, sir.
Fahrenheit 451 was not totally in Truffaut's control. I think that he was out of his element linguistically and geographically. He never mastered the English language. He never again agreed to do a film in English despite countless offers.
He didn't really speak any English. He never did the whole time we made the film. I don't know, I can hardly speak French anymore now, but I did learn. I mean, I had studied it in school, and I went sort of crash course. So we operated in French all the time. Of course, Helen Scott was with us all the time, so if there's any difficulties, she was there to translate. Then we had Mickey Delamare, who was associate producer and the general manager, who spoke French. He was half French. It so happened that Julie Christie spoke French. She had lived in France. And Nick Rogue, the cinematographer, spoke French. And, of course, Oscar Werner spoke French. So it was kind of curious making a film in English, but everybody mostly speaking French.
Editor Tom Noble.
My French consisted basically of the films of Cocteau and Léo Ferré. That was my French, basically. So if those words occurred in those two people, I was fine. But then I played nothing but French music, I read French books, so I got to be with Truffaut. I mean, I think by the end of the film, Francois was able to say to me, have a good weekend. But that was to the extent of his English. And it was very funny because all his contemporaries, you know, like Jean-Luc Godard and Louis Malle, all spoke fluent English. He really was very annoyed about that somehow.
The film was, of course, Truffaut's first film in color. And that was really because Universal demanded it to be in color. They wanted a color film. Truffaut, I think, probably would have preferred not to do color. It was not something he had coped with and thought about all that much. You know, he always said he shot it as if it were black and white, and then he found in the editing the certain color things that were distracting. Nick Roeg, of course, was a very fine cinematographer, and he was a terrific asset, not only because he was such a good cameraman, but because he was so genial. Everybody liked him a lot, and he kind of was a part of the glue that held it together. As far as the locations were concerned, of course, most of it was shot at the Pinewood Studios in London, and all the interiors you see were there.
In fact, that fire station was right next door to my cutting room. I mean, you can't really see it, but if there's the fire station and the little information box was here somewhere, the cutting rooms were down here. So you could always see, like, when they were shooting in the fire, like, oh, they're busy today, you know, and they're there where they would all be, the fire, and you'd be going in and out of this thing.
We did, as I recall, only three locations outside, one being, of course, the monorail or near Orléans in Paris, which we were there only a few days. It was a temporary track. It only ran about a mile or so, in which this company, French company, could sell it. You would come and see the monorail and how it worked, and then they would build it for you wherever you wanted it. One was the final scene of The Book People, which was quite near Pinewood Studios. I mean, it was within half an hour of there. And then the third one was this long street of houses, and the people come out as the television is announcing that Montag has escaped. And that was at Roehampton, which was a suburb of London. That was a more or less modern suburb. And plus there were particular houses which were nearby, in towns nearby.
In the 1960s, Truffaut was interviewing Alfred Hitchcock on tape with Helen Scott, and Fahrenheit 451 was released the same year that the book-length interview with Hitchcock was published. So I call it the Hitchcockian period. In Fahrenheit 451, Truffaut was working in a different kind of cinematography with the great, at the time, cinematographer Nicholas Roeg, who since then, of course, has become a major director in his own right. And I think that he was experimenting with Roeg ways of using visual expressiveness instead of dialogue to express the theme, the plot. So a little bit of the Hitchcock influence can be felt here.
Francois loves to quote from everything, but mostly from Hitchcock, obviously. I mean, that shot where you're dollying in and zooming out is definitely a vertigo moment, yeah. And he said to me, oh, you know when she takes the picture down, there's a book behind it? From the birds.
No, I can have it.
Yes. And so we were doing this all the time. The scene where there was a very long dissolve, it's like 24-foot dissolve, where the faces match. That was a quote again from The Wrong Man, you know, between Henry Fonda and the guy that really did the crime. You know, he and I would watch Hitchcock pictures sort of after shooting sort of every night, and, you know, he'd say, see this sequence coming up? 327 cuts and things like that. It was amazing.
Hitchcock had worked for many years in black and white, getting such gradations out of the palette of gray and light and dark, as in Psycho. And then he makes a film like Marnie, in which he pushes, Vertigo is another example, pushing color to extremes. And I think there's a little of that going on in this film as well. The redness, for example, of certain images in the film, the red thing you drop your letters in, it's more red than any typical red I know. We should also realize that Fahrenheit 451 gave him the chance to work with Bernard Herrmann, the great composer, responsible for, I think, 9 of Hitchcock's scores.
An incredibly lush score, but it really worked for the film. And I thought, well, this is actually, it was a very good score, you know, it really was. And it was, in a way, exactly what Francois wanted, with the whole Hitchcock connection.
I would call this not only a Hitchcockian period, but a time of Truffaut's experimentation.
That's what Francois thought, you know, like, let's try something different. Like the irises, you know, I mean, the irises were strange. But the most strange optical, I thought, in the whole film was when they're searching in that playground and half of the screen goes black, just to say, now here's the moment. And then it goes back again. It just tells you, like, and I'd never seen that. I've never seen it done since. It was the most extraordinary thing, but that's a pure Truffaut idea. And, you know, like, sometimes the sand fades to white. Francois wanted a nice white moment in it rather than just a conventional way of doing it.
An Enterprise Vineyard production. Oscar Werner, Julie Christie, in Fahrenheit 451.
I love the opening credit sequence where you have this zooming in to one antennae, television antennae after another, and there are no printed credits. They're spoken.
From a novel by Ray Bradbury. Music by Bernard Herrmann.
I was fascinated by the way that Truffaut was withholding the printed word from the audience, so that when we first see a printed word, it's like a privileged moment because we haven't had access to it before. Well, that's precisely the point of Fahrenheit 451, the story. Namely, it's a society that's burning books. Printed words are not allowed. So we're brought into this in a very interesting cinematic manner.
And I know we started off with the cousin announcer, the woman.
I think he just liked Gillian Lewis, who did as the television announcer, and used her for that voiceover.
An Enterprise Vineyard production. Oscar Werner, Julie Christie, in Fahrenheit 451. Co-starring Cyril Cusack, Anton Diffrie.
And then Francois decided he wanted a man's voice instead, and so at the last minute we put Alex Scott's voice in.
Screenplay by Francois Truffaut and Jean-Louis Richard. From a novel by Ray Bradbury.
Because of the science fiction films coming out, Truffaut didn't want this to be science fiction in quotation marks.
It's a mistake to walk in thinking, oh, a science fiction movie? It's a mistake going in thinking, oh, Ray Bradbury? Oh, sure, I know what he's up to in his books, and now I'm going to see the visualization.
Well, one of the flaws in the film, for me, is the absence of the mechanical hound, because he's a creature that helps tell you about the future.
I thought the robotic dogs and so on would be very, very difficult and really not what he was trying to do. I mean, it would be very distracting, in fact, from the simple story of the books, which is really what he was interested in most of all. So I think he was quite proper to avoid the more or less conventional science fiction. There were so many of them coming out at that point. And I think they made the right decision just to kind of withdraw from that and not make that the overwhelming aspect of the film.
I know that he talked about wanting it to be incredibly modern, but actually it was an indeterminate age. Although there were some things that were new, and yet they would have old-fashioned phones, really and truly. They would pick up these weird, cumbersome things.
Hello? Yes?
All those phones were kind of really old phones. Nowadays, you'd probably buy them as a replica in sharper image or something like this, because they are replicas,
Isn't it lovely? You like it?
When she gives him the cutthroat razor.
Isn't it smart? It's the very latest thing.
And throws away his old electric razor. It's a kind of weird twist on everything. It's as if they suddenly discovered like an antique. So it was just full of those sort of weirdnesses. And I think those were his directions, that he wanted that sort of look, that it wasn't sort of too futuristic. He always talked about Carole Lombard and things like that, that sort of look, like a 30s look. Particularly when she is Linda, that those were all sort of 30s costumes.
In there, go on.
And in the course of the film, you have elements of the Nazi and Holocaust past. The choice of Oscar Werner playing Montag, who has a German accent to begin with. The fact that they're wearing uniforms that look like stormtroopers. At one point, he greets the Captain Cyril Cusack with a salute that looks a bit like a Heil. And of course, the very fact that they're burning books. At one point, you actually have Cyril Cusack's character holding up a copy of Mein Kampf to burn.
We must burn the books, Montag.
I mean, there it is.
All the books.
One is reminded of the line, I think it's from Heinrich Heine, that any place where books are burned, people can be burned afterwards. That is, of course, literalized at one point in Fahrenheit 451, where you see the old woman who chooses to burn with her books, and the dream sequence where that image haunts Montag with a different character. So I see this now as having a more direct relationship to the Nazi past, at the same time that it is a more poetic, evocative vision of a future.
We're looking at the dailies, and it's in the first scene, almost of the film, where Montag is burning the books with the flamethrower. And Francois was saying to me, oh, God, you know, I went take after take after take, and Oscar just couldn't put the helmet on in one fluid moment. And it's so pity. So I said, well, that's the best take, so put it in. So, you know, I was running it backwards and forwards on the Moviola, and I noticed that later on there's a take where he actually takes everything off, somebody takes the gloves off for him and takes the flamethrower for him. And I realized that if you reverse the film, what would happen was exactly that. He'd actually put it on in one fluid move, that bang. The gloves would go on like this, and somebody would hand in the flamethrower instead of him giving it to them. So I reversed it, and I gave it to him, and I said, I cut it into the film for him. And he thought, oh, this is fantastic.
There were a number of special shots he put in reverse.
So you're in for promotion, Montag. Good luck.
When the firemen go up the pole, for example. And some of those effects had to do with Oscar's reluctance. He was very fearful of the fire.
You too, Montag.
When Oscar was doing the fire and backing away, he wanted him to approach, so he just reversed the film and had him coming back.
Montag! Get out of there! Montag! Come on, this way!
Truffaut had a very difficult time with Oscar, who had his own ideas about how the part should be played, not only his part, but other people's parts. The first time that he met Julie Christie, we met at the office, just Truffaut and myself and Oscar and Julie, and instead of saying, how are you, and I'm so delighted to work with you, he instantly launched into a lecture on how she should play her part, not his, which, you know, was a sign of trouble ahead.
The problem with Oscar was that, you know, obviously they'd had a ball making Julie Jim, and everybody got along incredibly well, but in between time, I think what had happened was that Oscar had gone off to America and made Ship of Fools, had love scenes with Simone Signoret, got the most incredible fan mail. Unbelievable. So when he came to work with Truffaut again, he was not the same Oscar Werner that had worked with him on Julie Jim. Now he considered himself to be a Hollywood star working with, you know, this French director, sort of, you know, fine, but, you know, I'm bigger than this now. And I think it started to sort of go wrong at that point.
The thing that exacerbated it was that Truffaut wrote his diary, started writing his diary of Fahrenheit, and the first episode appeared while we were still shooting, in which he had certain not very good things to say about Oscar. And I said to him, why will you publish this before we finish shooting? And he said, well, Oscar won't see it. And I said, well, I'm sure he will. People will send him copies of it, which I'm sure they did, because at that point he became very difficult. Oscar was difficult playing the part as Truffaut wanted it. He played it really kind of tough and this and that, and Truffaut wanted it in other ways. And at certain times he couldn't get him to do it. So he would use doubles some of the time from the rear views.
And when we came to cut, there were times when, you know, Francois would say to me, for God's sake, cut away from him before he starts to smile. I can't bear him smiling. So the relationship really deteriorated over the period of the picture.
He and Truffaut, over the last 2 weeks, wouldn't even speak to each other. I stayed on friendly terms with Oscar as much as I could, and you know, I had to more or less tell him what Truffaut wanted, back and forth. And Truffaut said to me, why do you speak to that guy? He's so terrible. Why do you speak to him? I said, well, I'm the producer. I've got to finish the film. He said, oh, yes, as if that hadn't occurred to him, you know.
It reached its absolute peak when Montag is on the run. And those guys come with their little rockets and everything, they're looking for him. And he's hiding in this boat, and he has to pull the tarpaulin over himself. And there's a close-up of his hand doing it. And Francois really disliked him so much by the end of the picture that when we had to do the pickup shots, he went round, this is what I heard anyway, on the set and picked the guy with the worst nicotine-stained hands that he could find to be Oscar's hand pulling this thing over. So it had deteriorated to that extent.
And actually the last week or so, less than a week, when we were shooting the Book People out on the location with the snow, Oscar had a trailer there, and he'd just sit in there and drink wine all day. He wouldn't come out, and I had to sit with him. And when they wanted him to come, then I would get him out of the trailer.
And during the last week of shooting, they were so hostile to one another that Oscar went and had his hair cut. If you look at the last 10 minutes of the film, you'll see the hair is different, and they had to ruffle it up and make it look like it was the week before. So Oscar told all this to me when he came over, when the film was finished.
Do you ever read the books you burn?
Why should I? First, I'm not interested. Second, I've better things to do. And third, it is forbidden.
Of course.
Julie Christie was wonderful to work with. I mean, she did anything she was told. And she had a natural charm about her. And Truffaut liked that a lot. I mean, she was just wonderful all the way.
Having Julie Christie play both Linda, the wife, and Clarisse, the new woman who opens him not only to new romantic possibilities, but to a new way of being. To have the same actress playing both is reminiscent of Truffaut's fascination with sisters in general. This comes through literally in the film Two English Girls, where the character played by Jean-Pierre Léaud is attracted to both Anne and Muriel, and at different times is lover to each of them. You get the sense that Linda and Clarisse are two sides of one coin. In other words, that there's a kind of raw material in each human being that can be shaped towards either positive or negative ends. In this case, towards either a blind, self-absorbed acceptance of the status quo, a kind of laziness in terms of spiritual and moral development, or that you can become a risk taker who makes a commitment to something beyond yourself, which is, of course, what Clarisse incarnates. And in the course of the film, you have Montag moving from the identity represented by Linda, he's a conformist, to that represented by Clarisse, when he finally breaks with his past and becomes the emblem of a new society. And I like the fact that it's the same face, slightly changed, that leads him either way.
Those two parts, he did make them physically different in the way they dressed and their hair and so on. And one of them he really wanted to photograph mostly in profile and the other one full face. But basically he didn't want her to act particularly differently. He wanted her to be fairly much the same. He wanted to be ambivalent. But really, finally, he had no love interest in this thing, which is, of course, very rare for his films.
Now, one could say that his early films contain a great deal of, well, I won't say sexuality because, you know, Truffaut was the most discreet of filmmakers. He rarely, if ever, presented any graphic nudity, any love scenes that one would call daring in terms of how much is shown. Rather, it's the romanticism of the characters and the way he depicts them that we could call sensual or containing a sexual aspect. In this film, he added to Bradbury's story images of autoeroticism. For example, a young woman in the train, you know, with her fur collar, or characters touching themselves. In other words, eroticism is reduced to narcissism. Of course, this is a society in which people are not living to their full human potential. So it makes sense that there is a de-eroticization. In other words, that the antiseptic or sterile quality of the landscape extends to the very bodies of the characters. Hey! I mean, the one time that Linda does have a kind of exciting sexual moment with her husband, it's attributed to her having taken pills.
I think of that scene where she's revived and they have more or less a love scene by the bed and fall on the bed. I think the fact is that Truffaut did not want to play that as a kind of sex scene. Interestingly enough, when we were finished the film and he had the cut, we were at a party at Universal in London, and Lew Wasserman was there because he was head of Universal, and he was trying to get Truffaut to extend that scene on the bed. He wanted to have him roll over, and he wanted to make it a longer scene and have some real sex, the only sex he could find in the film. And Truffaut would say, "Oh, no, I don't think so, I don't think so." And Lew was jumping up and down, waving his arms practically, trying to persuade him. But of course, Truffaut had the final cut, and he just smiled and said no. To me, the most interesting part of the film almost, I don't mean to dismiss the performers, but was the burning of the books, which went on and on. And we had those books in our office. We had hundreds of books from the beginning of the film, and he would play with them. We'd go around and pick ones out and play with them and toss them and put piles and so on. Every day this was done as a kind of ritual, which was fun to do because we'd come up with strange books.
Some of those books were favorite books of Francois, obviously. The trouble I had doing that Dali book was just those pages. There's like nothing but jump cuts in there to make the pages turn quicker. You know, he's like, no, I want this quick image. I thought, oh God, let me try and work this out. You know, he's like constantly trying to make it go faster. You know, the page would stop for 1 second and you jump cut about 3 feet out of it, and the next page would go. So if you look at it very carefully, you just see nothing but those little cuts all the way through.
Then, of course, how he lingered over the burning of them was kind of marvelous. The titles and the pages burning and so on. That was kind of wonderful, and that's really what thrilled him the most.
You see, there's a lot of French books in there. I mean, a lot. There's even the picture of Cahiers du Cinéma as well. Obviously, they were all sort of favorite books of Francois. You know, I think he probably brought them from Paris to put them in there. But you focused on the ones that really were important to him. And I'd know, he'd say to me, no, we've got to get this in. We've got to get the Saint-Simon in. We've got to get this in, you know. And so it was like that.
The one that always amused me the most, and I don't know why it was in there, it was the Spanish crossword puzzle book. But it always amused me, that one. I know that he was concerned about censorship in general. I mean, in fact, part of that was what this was about. It was about eliminating books. An interesting thing about censorship, when we was doing the book burning scene, the studio, I suppose the insurance department, wanted to eliminate all books that were by living authors that were not in public domain, on the fact that they would be maybe sued or whatever. And we just ignored that. And we said, to hell with it, because I think anybody who was around who had a book being burned in there would be very much flattered by it. I don't think anybody would want to say, how can you use my book in that? So we ignored that and went right ahead.
What's the matter with you? Aren't you well?
It's nothing. I've got to read. I've got to catch up with the remembrance of the past.
He was deeply concerned in his films with the way that we become human beings, the way in which we are civilized, in the best sense of the term, the way in which we are able to create a continuous self. Why is the written word or the book so important in Fahrenheit? Because, as Montag learns, a book is the process by which you record and communicate. It allows for the power of memory to come into play. At one point he asks his wife Linda, does she remember when they first met?
When did we first meet? And where?
What?
When did we meet for the first time?
I don't know. Let me think. No, I really can't remember.
Oh, that's rather sad. Don't you think I do? I think it's very sad.
A society that doesn't encourage reading is a society that will allow individual memory to perish along the way.
Sit down, come on, sit down. It will only take a minute.
Whatever's that? Darling, it's not a book.
That's what it is, it's a novel.
Oh, but a book? Oh, you mustn't. It's against the law.
Quiet, sit down and listen.
Later on, there's a scene where he reads to Linda's girlfriends. And that actually, as originally cut, was very much longer, as you can imagine. I mean, he read a long time. And there's an actress called Anne Bell, who's the one that cries. The other two are sort of totally unmoved by the thing. And I had cut the scene, played mostly on Anne Bell, because I felt the transition between her listening and being moved by it was really sort of crucial to the whole thing, because Oscar reading was not all that interesting, and the other two sort of just were, they were all, you know, like this the whole time. But Anne Bell gave this a most amazing performance. And I showed it to Truffaut, and he said, yeah, it's wonderful, but it's just too long. We cannot have him reading this length of time. And we started cutting it down and cutting it down and cutting it down, and I felt what happened in the end, she reacts too quickly. She responds, you know, too suddenly, and the scene got kind of wasted in a way because we overcut it. You know, it was a shame. And that performance just went by the board. You know, suddenly she's listening, next moment she's crying, next moment she's really emotional, and they all get up and leave.
That was sheer cruelty, Montag. You're a cruel man.
This was my first film. I didn't know that this is what happens all the time. You're constantly trying to cut it down and cut it down and cut it down and cut it down. And that's the problem. Sometimes you make things shorter, but they seem to be longer. And that was my first experience of it. You know, I had never realized that by sort of cutting something too much, you actually lose it. You know, it just falls through the cracks and it's gone. At some point, when Montag starts to read, you know that he's doomed, actually, and he's going to be found out eventually. The Anton Diffring character is always suspicious of Montag. He really doesn't like him, and is always catching Montag doing something he shouldn't be doing. He's even the face of, he's got a wig on as a school teacher, just that free cut that he put it. Anyway, that whole business of not connecting anymore to that whole fireman thing, he loses his ability to go up the pole, so he has to go up the stairs, and he can't even go down the pole. He has to walk down the stairs. And it's like, when I thought about it, there's no logical reasoning for it. I mean, there's no reason why somebody who starts to read books should lose the power to do that. And yet it kind of worked incredibly well.
What's this, Montag? Something wrong between you and the pole?
Obviously, he's going to, you know, the game is up because everybody else can do it and he can't.
The film was written entirely in French, I mean, with Jean-Louis Richard and Truffaut. And there were certain puns that I'm not particularly aware of, except the one about the book people, which was a livre and libre, being free, and books.
At the end of Fahrenheit 451, each of the characters that we watch has become an homme livre, a man book. But in French, that sounds a lot like homme libre, which is a free man.
That was a nice pun about the book people and the free people, livre and libre, which could not be translated. We had English poet, writer, David Rudkin. He was brought in to do he did a great deal of work on it. And he came in and did what he could with some of these things.
You follow the river upstream till you come to the old steam railway line. Then you go on and you go on until you get to where the book people live.
The good people?
The book people.
It's not a very good pun, if it is a pun at all, but at least it had some kind of relationship to what Truffaut and Jean-Louis were writing originally. David did a fair amount of work on individual scenes, but mostly on the words itself. There was nothing on the structure or anything else that he did.
They are books. Each one, men and women, everyone, commits a book they've chosen to memory, and they become the books.
Now here's Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And here's The Corsair by Byron. She used to be married to a chief of police.
When they did the book people scene, I mean, obviously, Francois decided, well, you know what, let's use some people that are on the crew. So he got the costume designer, Yvonne Blake, to play one of the little girls, and Alex Scott has this line about her, this is so-and-so and so-and-so, and you'll notice that she blushes or something like that, and she indeed goes red because she's so self-conscious about having to play a part in the movie. It's a very sweet moment, actually.
Oh, you see the little blonde coming towards us. Watch her blush.
I'm Jean-Paul Sartre's The Jewish Question. Delighted to meet you.
I'm The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury.
What are these characters doing at the end? They are memorizing a book. They're learning it by heart. To learn by heart means not only that it becomes all of you, but it's through the process of love that each of these people has chosen a text to become.
I have one with me.
Yes?
Is there not freedom in that very choice of which book you want to be?
What is it? Let me see. Tales of Mystery and Imagination by Edgar Allan Poe.
I love that Montag chooses to become Tales of Mystery and Imagination of Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, after being a functionary of the state, he will exist in the free realm of the imagination and fantasy.
Learn it quickly so that we can burn it.
You burn it?
Yes, of course, we have to, so that no one can take them away from us.
Yes, we burn the books, but we keep them up here, where nobody can find them.
Well, the last scene of the book people all reciting their books and talking and so on, the weather was just terrible, and we had to finish. We were at a finishing date, and we shot a lot of it. It was kind of rainy and awful looking.
When the first day's dailies turned up, I thought, this is iffy. It's kind of a little hokey, And I hope we get away with this.
Now, that skinny fellow is Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Where's Alice Through the Looking Glass today? She should be somewhere about. Ah, now there's The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. He ate his book so they couldn't burn it.
It was kind of a little bit pretentious in a strange way, that you didn't want this to be. You wanted to feel the emotion of it. But I thought, this is going to be really rough, and now we've got another day shooting on them tomorrow. And then the miraculous thing happened. It snowed overnight.
Truffaut had put this scene off until the very last, hoping to have good weather. We were in April, I believe, and it snowed. Well, he just said, we'll jump in, we'll take advantage and use the snow, which he did.
The whole place was blanketed in snow, and the next scene we were doing about this guy is this old man is reading to this boy about the Weir of Hermiston, I think it was, and he's talking about the first snows of winter, and it was just magical.
He was more afraid of death than of anything else, and he died as he thought he would, while the first snows of winter fell.
He was more afraid of death than of anything else.
And he died.
And he died while the first.
He died as he thought.
And something about that snow falling softly and there's people walking backwards and forwards made it all work. And I thought, oh, thank God. Because without that snow, it would be really touch and go. You know, it really would have been.
He was more afraid of death than of anything else. And he died as he thought he would, while the first snows of winter fell.
The ending of the film is one of the most beautiful endings on any film ever. I've had a theory for years. If you have a good film and end it badly, you have a bad film. If you have a medium film and end it beautifully, you have a beautiful film.
Première femme de mon père. Il avait tout.
Let's suppress it, but not a chronic.
Et pas de garçon.
At the end of the film, one gets the feeling that each of those people walking around reciting their texts is just as much self-absorbed as the narcissists caressing themselves in the train cars. In other words, they are not so much talking to one another as they are instruments of the text. In other words, they are not really existing as a completely socialized community, but rather as individual icons. But I also have to admit that there's the feeling of a certain muted triumph, namely that the book people will maintain a portion of civilization, that someday these books will still be alive, even if they are recounted rather than as written text. Audiences and critics were not very kind with Fahrenheit 451, and I think he suffered a great deal as a result. Truffaut was the kind of director who functioned with an amazing modesty. In other words, he never said, the audience just didn't get it. He said rather, I guess I didn't do it in a way that was understandable by the audience. And I believe that he looked upon this film as an unhappy chapter in his filmography.
It seems to me a much better film now than it did when it first came out. I think we were judging it by contemporary, momentary concerns, and the kind of integrity and what he was trying to say shines through in a way that I think it stands up extremely well. A lot of films just disappear after you see them a few years later and you think, how did I like that so much? But this one seems to me to stand up very well, and if not better than it seemed originally.
Fahrenheit 451 deserves a second and maybe even a third viewing before we can appreciate all the things that Truffaut was up to in making this film.
The film gets better every year because our films are getting worse. It's getting better because you have all these films that are brilliant technologically, but you come out aching and you're hungry. You haven't seen anything. Whereas with Truffaut, you've seen something.